I would like to introduce the next panel, the first one of today, a very important panel on cacao and the climate crisis, which is being moderated by Marco Wilcapi. Marco, hello, how are you?
Hello, good morning with everyone. Fine, thanks.
Good morning, it's nice to see you. So I will now put this panel in your capable hands and you can introduce your panelists. So everyone who's on Cacao and the Climate Crisis, go ahead and turn on your mics and your cameras, and we're looking forward to hearing your discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and for those watching us from other parts of the world, good afternoon and good evening as well. My name is Marco Wilcapi. I am the cocoa specialist at Promazonia, a United Nations Development Program project focused on deforestation-free production as an Ecuador RED Plus action plan. And I wish to welcome you to this panel. We have a number of distinguished speakers today who will talk about this important topic. I would like to welcome Monica Mena, Summer Allen, Ethan Budonsky, and Luis Orozco. At the end of this panel, we would like to give you hope and real examples of how we can fight the climate crisis. Well, in order to start, I would like to switch to Spanish to make more fluid this panel. Okay. Un contexto.
Muy bien. Para darles to give you general context, this panel will be divided in rounds of questions, and the purpose of the first round will be to get to know more about our panelists and their activities. And the second and third rounds will cover more specific topics related to the main theme. And finally, we will close with some future actions to tackle climate crisis. So let's get started. Can you hear me okay? Is everything okay?
Okay.
Great.
Okay,
perfect. So we're going to start. Just to give you some background, the Intergovernmental Group of Climate Change that was created in 1988 has been drafting reports to know more about climate change, about the strategies to respond to this issue. And it's the sixth report is being drafted now that will be presented this year. And it will talk about the Framework Convention of the United Nations, for climate change. The goal is to maintain a temperature at 1.5 degrees increase. This global effort applies to everyone who inhabits this planet. And in the case of the cacao value chain, we know that the main actors are small farmers around the world who are already being affected by the climate crisis. In this context, I would like to give the floor to Ethan, who can tell us a bit more about the main actions that are being carried out by Cacao Foundation to achieve their mission, where farmers empowered and the planet is healthy. We'll give you the floor, Ethan.
Wonderful, thank you. I would like to turn on my video if the host can allow me to do that.
1 second, please.
Of course.
Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, the hosts of the session today. I will be speaking in English. I'll speak as slowly as possible. But it truly is a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Ethan Badiansky. I am the Senior Director of Environment at the World Cocoa Foundation. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, the World Cocoa Foundation, we are an NGO based in Washington, D.C., but also in offices in West Africa and previously in Latin America. But as an NGO, our focus is on addressing the core challenges, the core priorities towards cocoa sustainability. In particular, farmer income, livelihoods, child labor, education, and then a healthy planet, which is what I'm focused on, which is a focus on climate change and deforestation. What makes the World Cocoa Foundation so unique is our membership base of over 100 cocoa and chocolate companies from around the world, big, small, manufacturers, traders, license buying companies, cooperatives, are all members of the World Cocoa Foundation. We represent about 80% of the entire cocoa supply chain. And our role at WCF, World Cocoa Foundation, is to convene the private sector, to lead them, to provide thought leadership, and to represent the private sector at times as well, but all in an effort to build collaboration, collective action, and an aligned approach towards addressing these core sustainability challenges. Now, as director or senior director of environment, back in 2016, I helped lead and launch the Climate Smart Cocoa program. And this was in partnership with USAID. We had other core partners that you'll be very familiar with, such as CIAT, such as the national governments of El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Nicaragua. We also worked in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And the goal of this Climate Smart Cocoa program was to identify the opportunities to incentivize greater private sector investment and focus in addressing and promoting climate resilience. And this was very much in response to studies and reports that came out by CIAT and others that demonstrated that as a result of climate change, there's likely to be a significant impact on the cocoa sector, on the cocoa productivity, on cocoa quality, on the livelihoods of those farmers, if we remain business as usual. So the Climate Smart Cocoa program is truly focused on how do you identify and incentivize the private sector and the national governments to collaborate and to do more. And we did this with two core objectives, or two core pathways. One was to develop national and regional level strategies for climate smart cocoa, and that's really about establishing the platforms and the partnerships and working together to carry out the research and then develop the overall strategy. And the second was then to identify best practices and innovations. We also worked with Biodiversity International to identify heat and drought tolerant planting material, all, for example, as well as developing materials for training in climate smart cocoa and training in best practices in agroforestry, all in an effort to then incentivize companies and the government to adopt these best practices and to scale them through their own programs. That 4-year program had a lot of success in really setting the foundation of our work on climate change, and it has since truly evolved within the organization and then within the cocoa sector as a whole. So the Climate Smart Cocoa program evolved into a much bigger and unprecedented effort that is now focused on tackling deforestation globally and in particular in West Africa. And we know that there is very much a direct link between climate change and deforestation, particularly in the cocoa sector. So we launched the Cocoa and Forest Initiative back in 2017, which is this joint collaboration, joint commitment between the industry and the governments in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Colombia to eliminate deforestation in the cocoa sector and restore degraded lands and forests. And before I go too deeply into this, because we have a lot of great speakers today, I'll just tell you that as of right now, we have 36 companies who many of whom you are very familiar with, who are all signatories of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, and we're making a lot of progress in our collaboration with the governments and with the other key stakeholders. And with that direct link to climate change, what you find is that a number of those innovations that we started to develop as part of the Climate Smart Cocoa program, going back to 2016, are now being taken up by the governments and by the companies in their commitments and their investments towards tackling deforestation. For example, since 2018, companies have invested in distributing more than 23 million multi-purpose trees to farmers for the promotion of cocoa agroforestry. In addition, just in this past year, we have trained over 450,000 farmers in climate smart cocoa best practices. So you see this direct link, and I think it really is an opportunity to package all of these learnings and our focus on climate change in this much broader and global effort towards addressing deforestation. And I look forward to telling you guys more about it as part of this conversation today. But I'll stop there.
Muchas gracias, Ethan. Este entorno global.
Thank you very much, Ethan. This global environment and understanding this is very important to know that our efforts shouldn't be individual and that they affect others. In that sense, let's talk about more practical things like MOCA and how their work is taking place in the Americas. So Luis, maybe you can tell us a bit more about this program, the countries where you're working, and as Ethan, you can tell us in a general way some more about the actions that you're taking. You have the floor.
No te logramos escuchar, Luis. Disculpa.
We can't hear you, Luis.
No. Tal vez desconectas el micrófono.
Maybe you can unplug your mic. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Marco, and all the guests to this summit. For me, it's an honor to join you today, and I'm going to try to summarize the efforts and initiatives of the MOCA program in the last 3.5 years of operation and interaction with Latin America. MOCA is a program financed by USAID. It's a 5-year program that operates in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Peru, and Ecuador in South America. This program is co-implemented with TechnoServe and Lutheran World Relief, and it works around a cacao value chain. We're working with around 20,000 small cacao producers. And we work with 2 mechanisms. First one, we have collaboration, technical collaboration programs with small producers, and also we have a relationship with the private sector with a program we call OMACHE. So we implement MOCA's goals through these 2 paths. This project is also linked to other institutions that provide services and support throughout the value chain. For example, we're closely working with CATIE in Costa Rica and CRC in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Biodiversity International and FCIA. So we have the support and the technical advice necessary to implement different regional strategies. So I would like to give you some background information about the field where MOCA is working. We know that there is around 10.2 million hectares where cacao is being grown, and most of them, well, some of it belongs to small farmers and other to big farmers. We know that around 30% of those fields grow in shade, which means that there's another percentage that grows without shade. So the role of cocoa in different sectors can have an impact on the environment. And I would say we work in 5 main lines of work. The first one is to make a baseline study to analyze the capacity of clonal crops and nurseries. This is important to understand how we can provide good material for the farmers. That baseline covered 220 nursery farms because it has helped us understand the genetic diversity existing in those areas so that we can provide more resilient varieties of cacao. These results have been shared in articles, forums, and also the project has worked on the mapping of cadmium in Central American countries. We don't have much information at the moment, and this seems to be a barrier to move forward for producers. We see that productivity and intensification and climate change and the lack of access to genetic material and the presence of cadmium and the lack of renovation are some issues that we have to face. Another action that MOCA is implementing that tackles climate crisis is that we have developed an international certification program for forestry and climate change. And in this program, we involved 175 technical staff who provide advisory. This includes some platforms that focus on climate crisis and adaptation measures at a level of farm and parcels. Also, we have invested in updating the mobile platform of Cacao, where we manage the knowledge about cacao and we make that information available to small and medium and big size farmers. There it's possible to find videos, testimonies of small producers, and information that summarizes good practices to tackle the climate crisis that affects the cacao sector. There's another important activity which is the broadening of the flavors map. This is something we're working with Soto company. This was an initiative that started in Central America, but this map of flavors is expanding to Guatemala, Salvador, Colombia, etc. And its objective is to disseminate information about that richness of flavors and grains that we can find in Latin America due to this diversity in genetics and the diversity of climates that we have. All these tools are aimed at providing enough conditions for producers to have their grains sold at a higher price with more profit, and that the products are more adapted to the environment. Finally, I would like to highlight that in Latin America, there is an urgent need to work on innovation and renovation of cacao. So MOCA is working on that too. We're providing assistance to producers, and we are looking for funding for more programs that renovate our cacao production. There are some crops that have been growing for decades, so they are not sustainable anymore. This is a reality that hasn't been tackled yet, and a good percent of the crops has to be renovated. So we have to rechannel resources and we have to provide technical assistance to support producers so that we can have better solid material. And I would summarize Mocha's work like this, and maybe we can talk more about this later. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Actually, some of the questions will dive deeper into that topic. Thank you. You have provided us with interesting information, and you mentioned training, clonal gardens, the maps of flavors, and this reminds me of the great diversity we have in our region, thanks to our forestry. So I would like to now give the floor to Summer so she can tell us more about her experience around this topic. You have the floor, Summer. Thank you.
I'll try to speak slowly. One of the things, I'm going to come from a different perspective. I'm an agriculture economist. I work with the Fine Chocolate and Cacao Institute at Harvard. And one of the things that we've been trying to do there is really understand how to kind of capture some of these indicators of deforestation, of canopy cover, of intercropping. And I think I would just start by saying I really, all of the work that WCF has done, as well as the MOCA project, all of that work has been really critical to really understand what works and what doesn't work. I think we can draw, especially in thinking about Latin America, we can draw lessons from what has been learned in West Africa. And I would say that one of the things that really sticks out to me in West Africa is really understanding producers' incentives. And so I think as a researcher, one of the things that I've done for Alter Eco Foundation, a partnership with FCCI and Alter Eco Foundation, is really try to look at all of the research that exists on agroforestry and cacao. And as you all know, on this panel, there's a lot of research on agroforestry and cacao and the benefits and the challenges that exist, and I won't go through all of those. But of course, we all know that agroforestry, cacao produced in an agroforestry system can be more resilient to climate change, offers a lot of benefits. The challenge, I think, from the research that has been shared and published so far has been that a lot of these incentives might be driven by companies that are really interested in cacao and perhaps less interested in the crops that are grown around the cacao. And so I think, there are a lot of research questions that still exist. What percentage of shade canopy can kind of meet that need in terms of yields for cacao, but also biodiversity concerns, carbon sequestration. And I think in general, the research shows that, 30 to 40% canopy can really balance those needs. Of course, it's dependent on the region of the world. It's dependent on the species that are included in that agroforestry system, and the soils, of course. So I would say there's a lot of research that needs to be done to really understand this relationship. I also think there's a lot more focus that's needed on producers. So FCCI also has a partnership with Uncommon Cacao, and many of you know Uncommon Cacao, and really trying to understand, in their associations, how many producers are already growing their cacao crops under an intercrop system? How much canopy cover do they have? Do they have agreements with their producers about deforestation? And I think this is, really understanding what's already happening. It was just mentioned, a lot of producers are growing their cacao in agroforestry systems. I guess, one of the things that I've seen is there's no really definition of agroforestry, right? So it might be a few trees on a plot. It might be a really dynamic agroforestry system. And so some context is also needed around these conversations of the benefits of agroforestry. I think that the mentions of capacity development that has been done is really important. I think all of the studies that I've seen so far in this research have shown that farmers really understanding the benefits for them in terms of, other types of crop markets for other types of crops that might be grown, longevity of their cacao trees as a result of agroforestry. These are all very important for farmers to adopt and continue to adopt an agroforestry system. There also needs to be market incentives for these other crops. There needs to be market incentives for payments for environmental services. Someone mentioned in the chat, if we're kind of promoting agroforestry, are companies willing to pay for this? And I think that's been kind of I would agree that's kind of an unanswered question. As of now, carbon payments are getting more robust, and I think producers can see that they can, capture carbon payments. But for the last few years, we've been trying to, I would say, a lot of organizations have been trying to push agroforestry without really backing it up with payments to producers, because in the end, producers have to make choices about their incomes, and that's what it comes down to. I would also say that youth should be more involved in these decisions. If we're talking about, carbon sequestration, it's only going to matter as long as those trees are standing. And if they're only standing for 10 years that an older farmer is involved in the farm, that's really not a helpful climate outcome. So I think more youth need to be involved in these conversations. I also think more women need to be involved in these conversations. It has been proven in research that women choose different agroforestry products for many reasons. Household needs are different. So from a diet diversity and a food security perspective, women and youth need to be involved in these conversations. I would just, also mention that we're working with Alter Eco Foundation because they have 6 different grants that they've been tracking the last few years, and they are doing agroforestry trials in 6 different countries, and including Ecuador, working with Punocasi, and really trying to understand. One of the roles of SCCI in that project is really trying to understand what are the impacts to incomes if we try to look at these diverse crops. What are the impacts in terms of productivity, in terms of cacao, and what are the impacts in terms of environmental measures? So working with South Pole to really measure carbon sequestration, for example, and species diversity on these plots. So they're working across different crops, including cacao, in 6 different countries. And it's small. It's much smaller than the projects that were just discussed, but I think these types of trials can really help us understand what works and what's helpful, and it includes things like capacity development for producers, how to do pruning, how to kind of manage these agroforestry systems with, I guess, somewhat less labor costs. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Somer, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Summer. When we talk about climate change, we talk about cross-cutting issues throughout the value chain. Carbon sequestration, shade, gender, and resilience. And we'll go back to those specific questions. And you also touched upon research, which is essential. For research, we need to carry out studies. And there we can talk about future scenarios. So this would lead to Monica's intervention. And so we would like to ask you, Monica, about your research, and later on you can tell us about the results of those studies. Good morning, everyone. I work for AgroArriba, a company from Eco Group, as a sustainability manager. And what we have done in Ecuador has been to work with organizations, universities, in projects with the IDB financing. And we are also working on this project, Smart Cacao, which is aimed at implementing techniques that reduce environmental impacts and that also help producers reduce their environmental impact, and they can reduce the gap between climate crisis and production so that we can have a better synergy. So in the last years, we have been working in several projects like evaluating what can happen in the next 50 years in the cacao scenario. Also, we have worked on mitigation measures and to prevent diseases, the control of temperature, plague control, and also we have worked in reforestation and evaluation of reforestation and to recover strategic areas that could be recovered, but from a more technical and agricultural perspective, because we cannot limit the productivity of a producer to increase shade without them having to increase their scope to maintain an increase of their income, because we have to work on those different pillars.
Lo que hemos hecho como compañía estos casi 4 o 5 años que venimos trabajando en estas iniciativas y hace 3 años.
This is a summary of what we've been doing and how we've worked with the IDB on a specific project. Thank you. Nika, you mentioned something very important. You spoke about sustainability in farmers and productivity. We've now closed our first round of questions, and now we will go on to more specific matters. I would like to start speaking about an important topic, which is conservation. I'd like to give the floor first to Ethan and then Summer. Can we speak about a positive relationship between productivity and conservation?
Yeah, in fact, we can, and I'm pretty excited to actually share this opportunity with everybody. So, what we're really focused on, now that we've evolved into this Cocoa and Forest initiative, is how can we drive the greatest amount of impact towards tackling deforestation and restoring degraded land. And we have 36 companies working with us, working with the government, working with other key stakeholders. And the challenge that we have in having all these different partners on board of CFI is that companies are really good about investing within their own supply chains, investing within their own silos. So you get a lot of investment, but it's very spread out. And what we are always challenged with is how do we drive the maximum amount of impact from these pretty significant investments that industry is making. So in order to do this, we have started to build out and develop models for landscape collaboration, landscape approaches. And I've got a couple of good examples of where this is actually coming forward, in which we're focused on conservation of remaining forests or forests within the landscape, as well as restoration and livelihoods improvement. So in the case of Ghana, for example, we are collaborating directly with the Ghanaian Forestry Commission as part of the Ghana Cocoa Forest Red Plus program, with the Ghana Cocoa Board and other key stakeholders, and then with 8 companies who are CFI members, to all collaborate in this pre-competitive space within this one landscape in Ghana, known as the Asunafo-Asitifi Hotspot Intervention Area. And our collaboration is focused on assessing what is the current state of forest and cocoa and land degradation and population and deforestation risk. Using that information and the social economic information of all of the farmers and communities within the landscape, then using that information in a very collaborative, very participatory process to then develop a management plan for this landscape that truly is focused on the conservation and preservation, the restoration the improving cocoa productivity, and that's where the focus is on cocoa agroforestry and climate smart cocoa best practices. And then the social inclusion, livelihoods improvement. Pulling all that together within the management plan, and now at this stage where we're at is actually turning the baseline, the management plan, to now an investment plan. How can we get all the different stakeholders, private sector, the government, and then ideally the other stakeholders working in the landscape and other interests abroad to now all co-invest within this one landscape towards these bigger and better goals of really developing a sustainable cocoa landscape in Ghana. And actually in Ghana we refer to it as a climate smart landscape in Ghana that is really focused on, promoting cocoa sustainability, restoration, and preservation. And that's the stage that we're at right now in Ghana. And then in the Ivory Coast, in Cote d'Ivoire, we are moving into a new phase of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative there, where we are now prioritizing with the government 4 to 5 priority regions in the country where we want to double down, where we want to really focus with private sector and government investment, and then with all the other important stakeholders on the preservation of remaining primary forests and the restoration and reforestation of degraded lands. And now we're in the middle of that phase right now in the Ivory Coast to identify these areas and then develop out the program plans and then work towards implementation, starting into the next year. This collaboration and the landscape approaches that we're really facilitating in both Ghana and the Ivory Coast are models that we think can be adapted and replicated in cocoa growing areas in other parts around the world. It's models that we're sharing and discussing with the Cocoa Forest and Peace Initiative in Colombia, discussions that we're having as part of Cocoa Action Brazil, and obviously other regions that would I think greatly benefit from building this greater collective action and collaboration of both industry and government working at that landscape level. Thanks.
Thank you, Ethan. So 2 great producers, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Thank you for those examples. You have the floor now, Summer.
Just to follow up on Ethan's comment about a landscape approach, I guess that would be one of the things that, does concern me about some of the conservation initiatives that are ongoing, is kind of this issue of spillover effects or leakage. So, really understanding if we're doing something great on one section of, a really biodiverse area, what's going to happen, I don't know, in a neighboring area that's forested, right? So trying to understand at a really broad landscape approach, what are the changes in terms of deforestation and what are we trying to avoid? I think, not to sound like this is an impossible piece of work to do, but I think there are some challenges. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think conservation starts with really listening to producers and understanding what they need, what crops they want to grow. There was a question about, we're really focused on market crops, and that's a good point. Really listening to producers that we're working with and understanding what crops they would grow, what crops they're eating and they could grow, and where there's a local market, not necessarily tropical fruit crops that need to be exported. And that's been really clear, I think, in some of the work that Alter Eco Foundation has done. Market prices were really a constraint for some of the agroforestry initiatives, because during COVID, a lot of market prices just did crazy things, right? So they couldn't really rely on that. And if producers don't have those market incentives, whether through carbon payments or being able to sell a basket of different products from their farms, they're going to have to make tough choices. And I think, the initiatives that have been done from Alter Eco Foundation, they've transitioned over 1,000 small-scale producers to regenerative agroforestry, and that's much smaller than Ethan's talking about, of course. But, I think it does bring some lessons about the importance of markets, the importance of training, for producers. A lot of producers as well didn't have the right types of planting products. So really making sure they have the entire basket of productive technology so that they can really be set to make these types of choices on their plots, and that they have financial backing to do that. I don't know if that gets to your question, but I think it's just something I want to point out that, I think the leakage question is really important as we're talking about transitioning producers to agroforestry, and to make sure that we're not damaging other areas for, saving a neighboring area.
Muchas gracias, Amber. Me quedo con esta frase.
Thank you, Summer. I'll name this phrase, incest production starts by listening to the producers. This is such an important lesson learned. Ethan, you have your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marco. And I didn't have an opportunity to mention this in my last statement, but I really like what Summer is saying, and I'm very much in agreement with not just with the leakage issue, and that's why on top of everything that we're doing on landscape approaches and investments, there also needs to be a way of actually monitoring how we're doing, and that's where innovations like satellite monitoring come into play to really see, are we making progress? Are we on tackling deforestation, on improving restoration and reforestation? Where are those areas of high risk? How do you apply a deforestation risk assessment methodology on top of what you're seeing to really identify where you need to prioritize? And just on that side, something really interesting that we're working on in partnership with World Resources Institute Global Forest Watch is actually to develop a sector-wide methodology for applying a deforestation risk assessment for cacao. Something that we hope will create a harmonized approach that industry and government will utilize alike, and something that will allow us to better prioritize where we need to be focused in terms of investments on protection and restoration and productivity. That's on one side. Then the other comments that Summer was making about participatory efforts, especially when it comes to agroforestry. That is one of the biggest challenges that I deal with as we're trying to drive the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, is how do you, whether we're talking about agroforestry, restoration, farmer training, how do you ensure that what you're trying to achieve is both farmer-focused and farmer-driven? Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to the farmer. If we're talking about traceability, how does traceability ultimately benefit the farmer? If we're talking about making investments in 23 million trees in cocoa agroforestry, how does that ultimately benefit the farmer? And as Summer was saying, there are pilot activities out there that are training 1,000 farmers in agroforestry. The challenge that we have is how do you scale that up to huge amounts where we're really going to have a sector-wide impact? So how do you scale up investments in agroforestry, for example, but still be able to maintain that farmer focus? And, World Cocoa Foundation, we are helping to build that criteria and drive best practices in agroforestry. And the foundation of what we put in our recommendations and training and criteria is it needs to be participatory. Whatever you do with that farmer has to be built or has to be designed, working directly with that farmer based upon market access, the local ecology, what are the farmer's needs, what are the opportunities, all with regards to making these investments in agroforestry. And the real challenge is how do you do that while at the same time trying to scale up into much bigger levels as well.
Gracias, Ethan, por lo que mencionas, importantes aportes. Luis.
Thank you, Ethan, for your important comments. Luis, you have the floor. Thank you, Marco. I wanted to add 3 ideas that I've picked up from the comments of our other panelists. And I want to mention that at the farm level, we see a turn towards experiments in different farms. This is ongoing. What I feel is lacking is how to take the outcomes of these research and share it with the producers. Maybe investigation is only staying at technical reports and research and scientific research. However, who can benefit from the results are small producers. Unfortunately, the extension mechanisms in our country are inactive. So this research is not connected to the reality. We from MOCA, we've tried to make important efforts trying to bring research results to technical teams. For the last 3 years, we've developed and conducted different meetings, the participation of all researchers. This investigation has been recorded and we can share it with universities, authorities, and governments. I think we are playing an important role connecting these sectors. We've also collected a lot of tools. We have Cacao Mobile, something like Sabías Que. These are didactic materials that share information and investigation results in an easier way to producers. We're working on small cards to help producers who do not have the technical knowledge on how to better work on the yield of their land. So I think what we're missing is this effort and working harder on connecting these areas, this knowledge with the producers. On the other hand, when we speak about environmental services, in Latin America, we have different plantation with different types of complexities, and we know what are the ecosystemic services that are provided. We know how much carbon can be emitted. We know the health of the soil and the land. And these are studies that will need to be conducted regionally. But this information is there. What we are lacking is what Summer is saying, incentive, remuneration, and the benefit that producers must receive for producing cacao in an environmentally friendly way. When I was working with Kathy in 2013, we conducted an exercise and we assessed the environmental services in all Americas, from Belize to Panama, and we analyzed different factors. Everything was studied. And from 2013 to this date, we have only one experience of payment by environmental services. Data is there and mechanisms for them to work are also available for the industry's market. The question is how to materialize this. This has implications on the permanence and the management of the soft cacao. If a producer does not have the trading channels for banana, for cassava, or lumber, they will not be investing enough and will not broaden areas to make it friendly with the environment. And this has been studied, and the producers abandons cacao plantation or replaces it for a less friendly practice that generates more resources. So we must tackle this comprehensively, the industry, and thinking about the different actors. There are studies in Bolivia and long-term studies in Bolivia and Honduras that inform us about a technical information on how to manage different crops. In our research we've supported in Honduras, we found that agroforestry cacao that has 65% shadow and has between 80 and 100 trees per hectare, productivity is above 1,000 kilos. And this has been the trend for 25 years we've assessed. Now, what will be the combination of species that can allow this to be maintained? There are also different softwares today that are modern and designed for us to imagine these agroforest models in the future. So I think what we need is to incorporate all these tools to better plan and design these new models, knowing about the interventions we must conduct in the market, in incentives, in access to funding, so producers are encouraged to continue planting cacao and that they find the benefit of doing it. Thank you, Luis. Monica. Oh, yes. I just wanted to add something to what my colleague panelists have mentioned. I think it is very important to talk about synergies among stakeholders of our value chain at all levels of this investigation process. I've seen there's a lot of literature about the infrastructure, and however, those who carry out assessments are looking at the environment but forget analyzing the productive implications in this process. And this must be a comprehensive analysis and assessment. We cannot leave aside the economic part. As you've mentioned, a producer or most cacao producers are small producers and they live on their daily income or weekly income. If I reduce their productivity, I'm impacting their daily income and they will not be thinking about their future in the medium or long term. They must make it day by day. And integrating this environmental process has to be aligned to improving the livelihoods of producers. And then we come back to what we talked about, incentives. But our cacao market cannot offer high incentives in terms of price, and not in Ecuador, where you cannot sell your carbon bonds. With small increases in prices, you will not be changing the life conditions of producers. That is why we're looking to increase productivity. If a farmer produces a ton of cacao, but we make it 2 tons in the potential of the yield of a crop by providing these environmental services in an adequate manner, then this will not affect productivity, and productivity will actually increase, and the producer will not need to expand their crops because deforestation is also an issue. These are the activities where we need to come together and where we need public policies. How to incentivize the company that is helping me with a process by not broadening new areas, like getting loans to buy fertilizer, but not for you to bring down trees or deforestate an area. So part of environmental impact comes from the use of energy or fertilizers. We often forget that companies that sell fertilizers to us are also using these sources. There are companies that are looking to reduce their carbon footprint. And then is when we need public policies to recognize companies who are providing resources that are more environmentally friendly, or at least have a zero carbon footprint, so I can buy inputs and supply that are not affecting my land. And at the same time, I'm mitigating climate change. We have to apply this at all levels of the chain. The small producer is only a small part of the chain. And if we analyze where CO2 emission is coming from. It's from energy and fossil fuel consumption. So everybody needs to contribute. If the state somehow allows us to reduce the custom incentives to companies who have this carbon footprint zero, then we'll have more competitors that are carbon neutral. This was my contribution to the question asked. Thank you so much, Monica. You addressed very important topics, and this makes me think about the following. We've spoken about the impacts of climate change in producers and farmers, but what happens with consumers? What is their counterpart? And we know there are regulations that address this matter of climate change, mainly from the reduction of deforestation. We have clear examples, Green Pact, Beyond Chocolate, and many others that are ongoing and that will, of course, have an impact on small producers. I'd like to ask Summer. I really like the logo, the logo Alter has on their chocolate bar. You mention it's the greenest. You can maybe explain this better to me, but I wanted to ask you, is there a market that is really paying a fair price for a sustainable chocolate, for a chocolate that is free of deforestation?
Well, FCCI doesn't produce chocolate. You're asking me about a certain certification, yeah?
Acerca
de
Okay.
Well,
acerca de...
I'm asking about the information of Alter Eco website, and I know they have a slogan. They say that they sell chocolate with several certifications.
You know, I think certifications are a challenge in terms of, there was just a question if we're going to have a certification for cacao free of deforestation free cacao, right? I think certifications are a challenge because they incentivize very particular things and kind of we're blinded to other things. So I think in terms of Alter Eco, I wouldn't be able to speak very well on how it has worked for them, their marketing campaign. I know that sustainability is a huge part of their business model, and that's one reason they're kind of moving to, investing in regenerative agriculture. So they're trying to assure that they buy cacao from producers that are transitioning or have already transitioned to agroforestry plots. So, but I'm not very well prepared to speak on that because I'm primarily doing research in terms of, the impacts in the future for some of their initiatives. But I will just take a moment and say that I think that Monica's statement, first, I really agree with what Luis said about, there's a lot of research that exists and that we really need to try to understand how to get that to producers. So working with technicals to really try to get that in a format that can be used. And I really appreciate Monica's statement that farmers aren't going to make decisions about benefits in the future if their need is now. I don't think I could have put it better. It was perfectly said. So not at all with your question, Luis, but I just wanted Marco, but I just wanted to mention that.
Está bien, Summer. Más bien, nuevamente, hago suelto la pregunta al...
That's fine, Summer. And this is a question for the panel. Is there a market that is willing to pay a price for a sustainable chocolate, that a production that reflects the efforts of the sustainable production? I can answer, Marco, with a little note I have of the market. We must first define what a good price is, because there will never be a good price for a small producer. $5, $20, $30, $100 for someone who needs to maintain their family. This is my first answer, but there are many companies that make a huge effort to pay additional prices after certification. One thing is a price we pay for a certification of a certain type of organic certification, for instance. Nevertheless, there are companies that go beyond and offer higher prices, not only for quality, but also because of these environmental initiatives for protecting forests, trees, and this is also very important. However, if we speak about chocolate, the world of chocolate is a small market in comparison to the bulk of cacao in general. Thus, the impact you can bring through these companies that are selling a brand for sustainability are very small, comparing them with cacao from the world. So we must focusing on prices is important because we need these initiatives and incentives for the producer, but this will not be the solution in the long term because a few dollars will not change the life of a producer, and there will be no price you can pay to improve the living conditions of a person. I've living on the field for 15 years, and every time I work with a producer, they talk about price, and they say if you produce more, you can earn more. The problem is this gap between producing sustainably and earning additional prizes for this. So this is our challenge as researchers, as NGOs or companies, how to create synergies that work for both sides. And I insist on economic, environmental, and social sustainability. If we do not have these three pillars, then we cannot speak about sustainability. We need this to be something projected in the long term. It's not a matter of selling bars of production that take care of the environment. The problem is that it's few of us in this trading line. However, we have industrialization that we must work upon, and price will not only be the answer for these large industries. No price will be able to close these commercial gaps in the world competition. This is my view.
Thank you, Monica. We have been talking for an hour now, and now we would like to give some space for questions and comments. But if you want to say something before we start, please feel free to do so. No? Okay. So we're going to try and answer some of the audience's questions. Here we have a question. It says,
companies use it to conserve forests to counteract the effects of climate change. Are these companies willing to finance these conservation actions or pay an additional amount so that the small producers continue conserving the forest? ¿Quién nos puede ayudar? Ethan, por favor.
Yeah, I would be
who
happy.
can help us with that? Ethan, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Just waiting for the translation. The answer is yes. Companies are willing and interested in investing in these types of conservation efforts. Keep in mind that as we're talking about all this great dialogue that we're having now, there's also a whole other kind of focus that the industry is having right now, and that's on the Science-Based Targets Initiative, greenhouse gas emissions or protocol targets as well. So within the companies themselves, they're also making these much broader commitments beyond the work that I'm doing on the Cocoa and Forest Initiative towards tackling, climate change and deforestation. So one of the pieces that I put a lot of effort into is how do I link these broader industry commitments towards SBTI towards achieving our commitments as, for example, part of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. But you are seeing the companies interested in making these direct investments in conservation. I gave you the example of where we're getting the collaboration of companies to co-invest within this one landscape in Ghana, the Asunafo Esitifi hotspot intervention area. And that's very much about getting the companies to put in more direct funding specifically into the conservation and protection and the restoration of these areas. And then I also gave the example of in Cote d'Ivoire, how we're now prioritizing. There's also a handful of other good examples. For example, Nestle in particular, they're working in one particular forest region called the Cavali Forest in Cote d'Ivoire, where they're partnering with earthworm. And the Cavali Forest is an area that's under a lot of pressure of new deforestation as a result of cocoa expansion. So they're using satellite imagery, they're using farmer sensitization, a focus on working with the government on enforcement and protection, putting in place the local-based solutions towards addressing these core challenges. And that's just one example of one company making significant investments in one landscape. And now the idea is how do we use that, but then we build upon to build greater kind of coordination and collaboration of the companies so that we can actually get even more investment. And then this is the other part I wanted to talk about, because this topic has come up a few times, and that is payment for environmental services, pago de servicios ambientales. How do you incentivize farmers towards the conservation protection side, agroforestry and restoration, and other core activities? So within our work, working with the industry, companies are piloting different models for payment for environmental services. The focus is heavily on agroforestry right now, and I hope that it eventually moves more towards the restoration and conservation piece. So our work now is to see who is doing, is to collect all of the learnings from the field, because it takes a few years to really determine are these PES models actually having an effect? To take these models from the field and then to work towards a more aligned and harmonized best practice towards PES that will ultimately bring those benefits down to the farm level. But companies are directly investing in these different pilots, working with a handful of different partners, external experts, and our aim now is to how do we move that towards actually developing best practices.
Gracias, Ethan.
Thank you, Ethan. You mentioned important topics like how to evidence those actions, and maybe a question from the public can lead our conversation even more, which is how can cacao free of deforestation can be evidenced? How can we see proof of that? If it has to be at the farm level, at jurisdictional level, and through which tools can we do that, prove or show that evidence? You have the floor, Ethan.
Oh, okay, great. I want to traceability. So we are very focused. So a core priority of what we're trying to do within the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, and then in alignment with EU due diligence, the UK due diligence, the US due diligence. But we were working on this even before any of that came out, is how do we improve traceability of cocoa all the way down to the farm level. And what we're focused on is from the farm to the first point of purchase, to really understand exactly where that cocoa comes from. Is it coming from a legal source, an illegal source? How's that information being used to track yields, to track the cocoa, to then work directly with that farmer to develop farm development plans and put in place innovations and activities specific for that farmer. So we have been working with companies towards developing an aligned approach towards traceability down to the farm level. And what we focus on is every farm is polygon mapped. All those polygons are linked directly to the farmer with a unique farmer ID. And then that company's using that information to then track that cocoa down to the farm level. And companies are implementing different innovations, different types of data platforms for the tracking, but we've really established that base criteria. We're then working with the national governments to put in place national traceability platforms, because the important piece, and Monica was talking about this, is when we're talking about deforestation-free cacao, we're talking about certification, we're only talking about one portion of the entire cocoa market. And even when we're talking about all these investments that industry is making in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, that's one part of the entire supply chain in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. What we really have to do is tackle both the direct and the indirect supply chains if we really want to see impact. And that's where the focus is working with the companies, but then very much so working with the national governments on national traceability systems that bring together both the direct and the supply chains together so that we know exactly where that cocoa is coming from, and interventions can then tackle, not tackle, but interventions can benefit farmers everywhere.
Gracias, Ethan. Por favor.
Thank you, Ethan. We'll give the floor to Luis and then Summer. Thank you, Marco and Ethan. Yes, I wanted to talk from the perspective from the cacao sector. All these zero deforestation cacao initiatives and regulatory frameworks and agreements that are being signed between governments, private sector, and cacao associations, they are setting the grounds to further work. However, I think that there's a missing piece of information from our side, and it's what Ethan mentioned, traceability. Where we work, most of the times we lack a system of traceability that is reliable. So without that foundation, it's difficult to have full traceability. It might be due to the lack of commitment from authorities. Maybe this role should be strengthened. If we don't have enough data, it is difficult to sit at the same table and negotiate because we don't have reliable information, or maybe because we don't fully understand how our sector works. Another aspect I would like to mention is the robustness of our industry. And this is based on my Mesoamerican experience. There are some associations that are called Commission of Cacao, Roundtable, Committee of Cacao. These are great efforts, but they are not fully representative. There is still a lack of association with farmers, with producers, for example, to discuss prices or to discuss pay for environmental services. I think we are taking steps towards that, but we haven't created enough conditions so that agriculturists can feel part of the conversation, and that is something that we still have to work on. And then finally, to say that a country has cocoa production that is free of deforestation, if we want to affirm that, we need to have enough data and enough traceability. For example, in Nicaragua and Peru, for that we use different tools. First, we use national statistics, and we also use interviews with experts to understand the discourse around the role of cacao as a deforestator or reforestator. And also we look for information about from the media. So we see some sort of mismatch between the information provided and the media. And we feel that in some places in Central or South America, there is the idea that cacao helps reforestation. But when we look at the magnitude of that reforestation effort at municipality level, we see that it only there was a reforestation percentage of only 2%. And we compared with other sectors, there is not such a big impact. So we don't have enough data to say that our role in this municipality, this is what cacao does. So that I can have enough information to negotiate and to reach these public-private agreements that provide us with more or better conditions. I think we still have a long way to go, but we're starting to work on that direction. Salma, you have the floor.
Completely with Luis that we need better data and we need producers associations to be involved in those discussions that are happening at the national level. It's incredibly important. I also just want to point out, while I think deforestation-free cacao obviously is a great goal, I am concerned that we are kind of moving down the path that, I will say, fair trade. We have stamps for a lot of things. Have they worked? Have we have seals for a lot of things? Have they had the impact we expected? I mean, I guess it depends on who you ask. Is a fair trade price a fair trade price, right? So I think, it's important to really understand, as was mentioned already, it's really important to use the data that exists, satellite data, mapping farms, as Ethan was talking about, but also really understanding at a local level what's happening and what are the drivers and what's happening in neighboring plots. So just to not lose sight of we're asking the producers to do a lot. We're asking them to pay high prices. We're asking them to work for prices that are probably not fair in most cases. We're asking them to do additional activities on their farm to create these kind of systems, do pruning and additional not use non-organic chemicals. We're asking producers to do a lot, and I think just as an industry, it's important to be cognizant of, at some point, when do they give up on growing cacao in this way? It becomes a lot. So as Monica mentioned, they need payments. Everyone has mentioned on the panel, it's really important to pay producers to do all of these things we're asking them to do for all of these certifications that we want. And that's it.
Mónica, por favor, tus últimas apreciaciones.
Mónica, you have the floor. And with that, we will finish this panel. Yes, it is important to consider which lines of action have to be devoted to this research, and we need to have research lines, taking into account the different stakeholders, because when we talk about evaluations, these have to be with the same criteria, so we can have more standardized information, so that we don't do investigation that was already done before, and we can share information among different countries. Because I saw some questions saying, how do I do that? For example, you have to analyze what is your temperature, your humidity, etc. And based on that, you have to make a decision. You cannot copy the same methodology in another country because our conditions change. But if we don't do research with the same guidelines and we don't use the same methodologies, the results won't be it won't be comparable and we won't be able to move forward. That is why it's important to involve people who have experience growing cacao and that can provide their feedback to determine those guidelines for research. If we do that, we can have more productive plantations and also with environmental efforts. Thank you, Monica. In Pro Amazonia, actually, we're working with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment. We want them to work together. It hasn't been easy, but we're gathering some data and we're discussing that data available so that the decisions have better foundation. Thank you so much for this panel. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. It has been very interesting. We could spend hours talking about these topics, but I'm very, very grateful and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marco and Luis, Ethan, Monica, and Summer. Indeed, this is a topic that we could have an entire summit just on cacao and the climate crisis. So I really appreciate all of your perspectives and all of your input. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope our audience got as much out of this panel as I did. There's a lot of work to do, and that's why we're here, because we're putting out ideas to keep doing this work and keep building resilience.